There is a kind of structure to today's talk, but as we go through it, I really want to emphasize three themes in particular, and we'll keep coming back to these back and forth over time. And unlike Rick Perry, the presidential candidate, I hope I'll remember what the third one is by the time I get to it. The first is, when we make change in our schools, whether it's the principal and the teachers or whether it's the teachers and teachers, is change something we push, where people push us, or where we push each other, or is change something we pull, that we draw out of people over time? This is not an idle comment, because the next book, which will be out in February with a mystery title, is by Michael Fullen and myself, and it's on the future of the teaching profession. And we agree on a lot and disagree on some things, so you should try writing a book with somebody you disagree with. And you should try doing a project with somebody you disagree with, because you come out differently from it at the end than you come out at the beginning, both of you. And that's a good thing, not a bad thing. One of the things we went backwards and forwards on all the time was whether change is something you should push, sort of start at the top and then kind of push it through the system, or push each other, or whether it's something you draw out of people, you pull out of people. That's one thing we'll come back and forth on. Second is that, particularly in the United States, but not just there's a tendency in the idea of improving teaching now, where there's a lot of research that shows, and it won't terribly surprise you, that the thing that's most important for student achievement in schools, actually the most important factor in schools, is the quality of the teacher. And there's a lot of talk in the US and in other countries about how you do something about that. And most of the emphasis is on the extremes. So most of the emphasis is either on what you do about preparing new teachers who are just getting started and mentoring them in their first year or two, very, very important, sort of picking the right people and getting them up and going early on. And the other one is always, I always think it's of the problem of aging teachers. There's a little less talk about it now than there used to be, but still a lot about that, and unions within the United States. The problem of, we have an aging teacher profession. It's almost like, we've got a decaying, almost dead, clinically teaching profession. And, someone who's getting a bit aging myself now, so my number begins with a 6. And I'm not telling you the second digit, because I'll be in denial over the next 10 years. But there's aging is never used in a good way. It's always used, I find when you hit 60, certainly in Boston, people expect you to eat in certain kind of restaurants and to be finished by 7 o'clock. And the restaurants should have oak-paneled boardrooms in, and definitely shouldn't have a lot of noise or ambient cool music, or people half your age who might be disgusted to see you walking in the same place. So aging teachers is seen not as an opportunity, it's seen as a kind of problem, and people think, what can you do? How can you get rid of them? How can you make space for other people? But the truth is, whether you're looking at the beginning or the end, and it's the same for schools, and it's the same for competence in teaching. Either, do you concentrate on the ones that are doing really, really well, and tell everybody be like that? Or do you concentrate on the ones who are doing really, really badly? And you say, let's get a data wall for these, and let's plot everybody in red, green, and amber. We're doing it for the kids, but soon they'll be doing it for the teachers. The principal will have you on a data wall looking where, if all the teachers are moving along just as they should be. Red, green, and amber, red, green, and amber. And then they'll have interventions. Sorry, am I going too fast? And then they'll have intervention strategies, basically just in time, that'll get fabulous results within 2 weeks. So we concentrate at the extremes. None of these strategies really look at how you move forward the big mass of people. how you get most people moving forward, not just the ones who are falling behind here or the ones who are fabulous up here, but like the big, big group in the middle, the big, big group in terms of competence, the big, big group in terms of age and experience. They're not the same. The research that Michael Fullen and I have found, and some of which we've contributed to, is the point at which teachers in most places are at the peak of their confidence and capability is between about 8 and 20 years in the profession. It takes you about 8 years to get to the top of your game. It doesn't mean you're awful before that, but it means don't go before 8 years because you've not hit your stride yet. So hang in there. And then you got about 12 really, really good years, and then, and then you die, basically. The evidence after 20 is that actually there tends to be a dip, but there's actually huge variation. And that depends on a lot of other things, like what's going on in your life, what's going on in your school, how your principal treats you, and so on. So the first issue is, do we push? Do we pull? The second issue is the answer is in the middle. And what's the third issue? What's the third issue? Oh, just wait a minute. I'll just have a look down here and see what the third issue is. Here we go. It's irony. You're okay. The third issue is, I believe it's time, after all that Ontario has achieved and how well it is known around the world, for Ontario to tell a different story about itself. It is time in some areas to tell a new story about itself, where after 7 years of accomplishment, the new direction is going to be, which is what all highly successful organizations do. You change not when you're declining, you change when you're at the top of your game. We'll see this in Singapore a little later on. And secondly, it's about telling a story about some things that already exist, but that haven't had a lot of external profile to people elsewhere. And TLLP is not the only one, but is one of the most powerful things of what exists that contributes so well to the quality of this province, for which it is now internationally renowned. So the third issue is about telling a different story about itself. And to do that, I'm going to take my 6-gun out of my pocket and begin to move you through some different ways of educational change that the older ones, the practically dead, or will remember. I'm going to give you some examples of high performance from different parts of the world that you may connect with. And I'm going to explore with you some ways of moving forward from where you are here. So let's begin with hands up if you are over 50 years old. I'm surprised you can get your hand up, but well done. That's fantastic. Brilliant, brilliant. That's the first benchmark, basically. Can you still get your hand up? That's the main thing. If you started teaching in the 1960s or 1970s, and we've done a lot of research on this, a lot of it in Ontario, actually. Teachers' experiences of change in 8 secondary schools over 30 or more years. If you remember this, and people do, people remember the first few years when they started teaching, and that tends to shape the way they look at their teaching for the rest of their career. So be very careful what you do with your new teachers. You're really shaping their vision of what the profession is all about. You're not just helping them, develop a few skills and capabilities, important as they happen to be. If you started in the 60s and 70s, you'll probably remember, as the older teachers we talked to did, that this was a time when you had a lot of autonomy and independence, when you were expected to and could make up a lot of the curriculum yourself. I used to make it on little cards, covered, we still do actually, covered in see-through transparent plastic, and invent the curriculum. So for practical maths, it involved things like, question, will the piano go through the door? And my class was actually in 3 or 4 rooms in an 1870 building at the same time. So I was a bit shocked about half an hour later to come back and find 4 children trying to push the piano through the door rather than calculating it. So the good news is you could make up curriculum by yourself, and the bad news was you had to make up curriculum all by yourself. And in some places this was great. It was excellent innovation. And in some places it wasn't great innovation at all. There was autonomy, but there was autonomy to do sketchy, dodgy things, as well as autonomy to do really great things. Some of the autonomy was very disciplined, because this was also a time not just of experimentation, but it was a time that many people remember where teaching was about changing the world, not just about helping individual children. Teaching was about shaping the next generation. This was the age of civil rights. It was the age, and Anne reminds us of this every time she stands up and reminds us how much of a battle it still has to be fought in many places. It was the age of gender equity, or as it was first called, women's liberation. It was a time of protest against the war in Vietnam, or in my country in England, against apartheid in South Africa. It was a time when people wanted to change the world. And sometimes it looked like this, very, very disciplined, very, very organized, very together. So in the 1970s, there was some very good innovation, and there was some absolutely awful innovation, and no ways to check or to connect it. It's very important, therefore, for people around about my age to acknowledge that doing what we're doing now, what you're doing in TLLP, is not just saying it's the 1970s coming back again. Everything comes back over time. Things do come back, but never in the same way. So we have things to learn from this first way, and we have things to reconnect with, but we should never see that what we're doing is, are you with me? That we're repeating them exactly. So after the first wave, which went through to, in most countries, to the late 70s, things started to tighten up. We started in this province to focus on the transition years. Do you remember that? We had outcomes-based education. We had alternative forms of assessment. We began to sort of set a direction for the curriculum, to bring in a bit the scope for freedom that teachers have, and to try and get some consistency. And actually this wasn't going too badly until the second wave came in, when money was running out, driven by these two people who were both inspired by not Mike Harris, by Auguste Pinochet of Chile. In education, this meant a highly centralized curriculum, the introduction of standardized testing, league tables of performance, less support for teachers, more time spent in classrooms, and less opportunity for innovation. These were the Mike Harris years in Ontario and my colleagues and I studied these, and they had some but not many benefits. They did develop in some places more of a sense of urgency than there had been, and in other countries, not this one, they began to get more attention numerically to issues of equity. Who was ahead? Who was behind? How did you narrow the gap between them? But the costs of this top-down pressure, and many of you remember it, and when I go out to British Columbia and Alberta, I meet many Ontario refugees as teachers who fled the country to go out west, and it wasn't just for the rain in Vancouver that they did it, to escape from a regime under Mike Harris that our evidence showed in a little book called Teaching in the Knowledge Society actually made teachers feel less competent, have less time for community, be more likely to retire, and be less likely to advise their own children to go into the teaching profession as a result of what they'd experienced. So these were the Harris years, or the Reagan years, or the Thatcher years. And eventually, in all countries, except the United States, which is still not waking up to this, the public as well as the profession, and in this province, Annie Kidder was hugely important in terms of raising public awareness, began to protest and see that this was not what they wanted from their public school system. And so from this age, we moved into this period. This is the period of the third way. The third way came through in most countries in the 1990s and was inspired by these three men. On the left, Bill Clinton. In the middle, Gerhard Schroeder from Germany, who wrote a pamphlet called Die Mittelweg. And on the right, well, this is extraordinarily helpful. I want to use the horse metaphor to help you think about the relationship, as Paul Anthony was beginning to explore with you, between improvement, which means getting better at stuff you already do, and innovation, which means doing something else. And both these things are important. The question is what's the relationship between them? And so here's on the top, you're either innovating or you're not innovating. And down the side, you're either improving or you're not improving. Now, if you're not innovating and not improving, I'd like to submit to you, you're a dead horse. In fact, with no disrespect to donkeys, you're a dead donkey and the flies are buzzing around you. If you're improving, but you're not innovating, you're the best horse that there can be. You are not a wild stallion, but you're a disciplined, focused racehorse who can win every race that is coming. You're tops in the Kentucky Derby, or Derby as you might variously pronounce it, every year. What are you if you're innovating, but you're not improving? You are Pegasus. You are the... Can you do that again? Yeah. You are a kind of wild, crazy, fantastical, beautiful, winged horse, but you're impossible, you can't exist. And if you're innovating, but you're not really checking whether it's making anything better, it's just weird and wacky stuff. You're playing Cecilia to the assembled group in front of you. Probably You are the Pegasus of educational change. Where all of us probably want to get to eventually is if you're improving and innovating. And if you're doing this, you're a Ferrari. You have horsepower, more than any horse itself can have, but you express it in a different way. This is what's happening if you're innovating. I've not published this yet, but I've got a terrible feeling that Paul's going to be taking this slide everywhere, basically. And I'll sell it to you for a very large amount of money. Okay? So, what if these horses were countries or provinces? Which horse would we put where? I would like to submit, though Anne may disagree with me, that in the main, the dead horse at the moment is the United States of America, which is pursuing largely on a system-wide scale, with some tweaks here or there, a second way strategy of actually reducing professionalism in teaching, of qualifying teachers by many short-term alternate routes rather than lengthening the period of qualification, and by still having a fairly rigid atmosphere of tested standardization and prescription. There are exceptions, but in the main, this is where the general thrust is. It's a longer discussion. And we're probably going to get the same debate about this one now, which is, this of course is the CN Tower, which in terms of the image of Ontario, but I'm going to ask you to judge the reality in a second, is in stellar terms improving, but in terms of how other people see it particularly, is not yet in any profound way innovating, although this is a magnificent exception, and it's not the only exception, as I'll go on to share with you. If you're up here, you're into 21st century skills, but you're more invested in the technology, in the gizmos and the gadgets, than you are in the impact on student learning. So far, there is pretty much no large-scale evidence that technology of itself increases student achievement. There are pre-tests and post-tests on particular projects. It can and should make a difference in your school. I'll come on to these again. But technology is not a driver of change. First, think about pedagogy. And second, think about how the technology can enhance the learning, not how technology can drive the learning. And last, down here, this is a set of mountains with a horse underneath, you're probably going to say. This is actually the province of Alberta. Okay, these are the Rockies in Alberta. And what I'll want to sketch out for you in a second is that in a deliberate way and in a very public way, Alberta is both innovating systemically and improving at the same time. In fact, Alberta and Ontario are very close to each other in their performance. And I'm going to show you how that is now. So on the international PISA tables, look at this. This is where the different provinces are. Just take a look. This is within Canada. Reading, maths, and science. There's the rankings. Here's the rankings with just a different color applied to one of the provinces. Alberta, Ontario. Alberta, Ontario. Alberta, Ontario. Now, I'm not just here to make you feel bad that you're not in Alberta rather than in Ontario. Because the other thing is the differences between these are very, very tiny. In some cases, it's 90% of a perfect score on PISA, and the differences are about 2% or less. And the only place when you're in the 90s that 2 points make a difference is on a basketball court. Anywhere else, it's pretty irrelevant. So nobody should flog themselves to death trying to be as good as the province that's just ahead of them. But people around the world do this. The Norwegians say, well, at least we could be as good as the Swedes, because they're the one right next door. So the differences are very small, but the performance of all the provinces is very high. And by the way, of 4 of Canada's provinces on PISA. And yet their policies are totally different. That's the funny thing. They have the same result, but with totally different recent policies. And in fact, any policies you've had in elementary schools in the last 7 years has no impact on PISA, because your kids haven't gone through yet. So the PISA results in terms of specific policies are probably more reflective of what the Mike Harris government was doing, which seems a little bit improbable. So we have to think about what is it that's affecting performance on PISA across all these 4 provinces, where Canada does very well compared to other countries in the world, like Singapore, like Finland, and, but not quite like the 2 places in China that aren't actually countries that Annie was describing to you before. So there are, and what it is in many ways is the characteristics of a country, its long-term policies that transcend many governments, not just one, the quality of its teachers, the ways that they work together. And in TLLP, I see many qualities that I saw not in exactly the same form, but in similar terms in the late 80s, early 90s, mid-90s, right through to the Harris years. Teachers collaborating, teachers doing cooperative learning, at all levels in many ways. Teachers building cultures of collaboration, teachers engaging in alternate forms of assessment. This has been going on here in this province for 20 years. And it went underground during the Mike Harris years. But now you've found your wings again, even almost your Pegasus wings. And you're taking flight. Because it's these long-term ways in which teachers engage with change that come to life in different forms from time to time that I would want to argue, rather than this policy or that policy, have a profound effect on the standards of achievement in these different places. Okay. Alberta, for 11 years, has had something rather like you're doing, but on a huge scale. It's had the Alberta Initiative for School Improvement, where 90% of the schools have 2% of the Alberta budget, $80 million, to design their own innovations, school by school, in 3-yearly cycles. It's massive. What this means is, what you've committed is huge. 100, what is it, 100, how many thousand teachers? 1,500 teachers. In Alberta, it's 90% of the schools, under a 39-year-old progressive conservative government, where the union and the government work together so that innovation becomes part of every school's experience in projects as diverse as yours. The Suzuki method of balance and harmony across the curriculum, developing a sense of local history, working with Aboriginal communities to develop literacy and parents' engagements with their own reading by telling stories which are then converted into writing, as diverse as yours on a huge scale. All these things and you represent what I believe is a 4th way of educational change that looks like this. Not top-down pressure, bottom-up support, and a bit of lateral interaction, but a 3-sided triangle where there is a vision, a compelling vision at the provincial level. The public is engaged. There isn't just confidence from the public, but there's active engagement from the public. And where the profession gets a bit more autonomy from government, as it's doing really, really well, but a bit less autonomy from the public. So it's a trade. You get more autonomy here, but compared to the 1970s, less autonomy from here. And when you have this, it's very simple, but in this fourth way of educational change, you're not a dead horse, you're not a stallion, you're not a Pegasus, but you're the ecologically correct equivalent of a very fast Ferrari. I don't think there is an ecologically correct Ferrari right now, but this is what you are. You innovate and you improve at one and the same time. And in this, you understand, and everybody understands, the following. That the opposite of pressure is not support. If you think of massage, shiatsu, that the opposite of pressure is release. We've had the pressure for a while in different forms. I believe that the professional quality of this province and of other systems that are or want to be fourth way systems is that it can now release the energy that there is in the teaching force through this project and on a wider scale, so that innovation is not just pushed through the system, but is pulled out of the system as well. There should be push sometimes, but also push back. We've seen from one of the 10 districts we've been looking at here, the superintendent, the director, who said, passionately committed to Aboriginal education of quality, and that he'd really pushed his principals and teachers to have challenging conversations about raising expectations. And then we did a case report on his district. And he said, this case report is so valuable to me and to the district because I have learned that what I thought were challenging conversations have sometimes been perceived as oppressive conversations by some of my staff. And I need to pay attention to that and listen to the experience that they are having. If you push, a push can too quickly become a shove. It can become abusive. It can become, and I've almost finished, it can become like the characterization that McKinsey and Co. made of an example they saw in Ontario that read like this. And it's in the book that Michael Fullen and I have written. And here's what they say. And we regard this as a push that's turning into a bit of an unacceptable shove, whereas they regard it as a fine example of peer-to-peer interaction in teaching. Here's what McKinsey's example is of. This is the story of a teacher who joined a primary school that had established the routines of collaborative practice as part of its literacy and numeracy strategy. These were professional learning communities through which teachers jointly reviewed student work and developed teaching methods. In that teacher's first week in the new school, 2 of his colleagues visited him and suggested that he should use word walls because they'd found them to be effective. When 2 weeks later he'd not put up the word walls, his colleagues visited him again, this time urging him more strongly to put up the word walls, sitting him down to share why this practice in their school should be used and the difference it made for students. A few weeks later, by then well into the school term, he'd still not put up the word walls. His colleagues stopped by again after school, this time simply saying, "We are here to put up your word walls, and we can help you to use them." I don't think they quite meant it in that tone. That's just my sort of artistic license. As professionals in that school, they developed a model of instruction they found effective, so they expected others to use it too. McKinsey sees this as an example of positive peer-to-peer interaction. I'm not sure that when you sit somebody down as a colleague, you have maintained that level of professional integrity and equity that we need to have together. The third way is about pushing. The third way is about pressure and support. The third way is about sitting people down and making sure that they use the stuff that has been recommended. The fourth way is about pulling as well as pushing. The fourth way is about responding, is about pushing back as well as getting the push for you. The fourth way is about lively interaction in relation to the things that you are passionate about and that are connected to and valuable for your students, whether they are new immigrants, whether they are old order Mennonites, whether they are Franco-Ontarians, whether they are First Nations people. Whatever they are, it's what suits and fits that community and engages them and unleashes them the best. The opposite of pressure is release. It's time for teachers to be released. For the 1,500 to 1,800 teachers in this project and for all the teachers in the province. If the province has gained so much and done so much and in 7 years become so successful, remove the shiatsu, release the energy, and see the power of what you do and can bring forward. That is the fourth way. Thank you very much indeed.